Hello everyone, I'm Oloshidim and this is my first Brotato guide. I've over 1300 hours in the game so far and a 61 win streak playing random weapons. Despite that, there will be over 60 characters by the time the DLC Abyssal Terrors launches, and this makes it very difficult to cover everything and test all the possible builds that each character can utilize. This guide is specifically for up to wave 20 gameplay, and I'll try to focus on general aspects of the game that apply to almost every character. First of all, the most important aspects of Brotato are the weapons and the stats. The weapons are usually defining the type of build that you're going for, while the stats are acquired from items and levels, and their priority depends on the weapon and the character. There are many different stats, but we can split them into offense, defense, utility, and economy stats. Usually, the show priority for most characters is something like this: weapons, economy, offense, defense, and utility. Filling up your weapon slots as quickly as possible is usually the best upgrade to your character. It's more likely to find weapons in the first shops, and early on, weapons are also fairly cheap. Weapon upgrades are very good, but they can be quite expensive, and usually it's not a priority early on since scaling your other stats first is often more efficient. You still want to buy them if you find them, but it's just not as impactful as getting more stats. Early game waves are usually fairly easy for most characters, so taking economy stats is a good way to get more long-term value. Stat-wise, this is mostly just harvesting, but we can put into this group any item that generates value over time, like trees, coupons, extra experience items, etc. In general, offense is more important than defense because it's necessary to keep up with the enemies. Killing enemies quickly not only makes the game easier, but it's also how most characters make their money and experience, which is necessary to become progressively stronger and avoid falling even further behind. The main offensive stats are flat damage, which is melee, ranged, elemental, and engineering, damage percentage, and attack speed. Overall, all of them have a similar value, with some having more or less of a priority depending on the weapon. Especially early on, this is the priority for most weapons: flat damage, attack speed, damage percentage. Balancing them out is usually the best approach across the entire run. Crit chance is also another offensive stat, but it's rarely built on most weapons, while others avoid it entirely. The main reason is that it's an expensive stat, and outside of weapons with high critical multiplier or extra effects on crit, it's usually not worth the investment. The value of defensive stats varies a lot depending on the build, but in general they're extremely valuable for extra safety, especially against elite and bosses. Defensive stats can be split into mitigation and sustain. Mitigation is everything that allows you to take more hits, like health, armor, dodge, while sustain is any kind of heal. A good balance between mitigation and sustain is usually what you're looking for, so that you are able to survive multiple hits and heal up before taking some more. Armor is usually the best defensive stat since it reduces the incoming damage, and it has even more value when combined with good sustain. It's usually a high priority stat, even early on and especially for melee builds. More health is always good, and you want a certain amount to utilize all the other defenses. However, after a certain point, health becomes progressively less useful, since it will be more efficient to boost the other defensive stats. Dodge is a good but unreliable stat, and it can be quite expensive to build. For this reason, it's often avoided in some builds, especially with ranged weapons, and it's not an early game priority for the others. This is because dodge is good mitigation, but you don't want to rely on it, so it's often better to push the other defenses first. The main sustain stats are health regeneration and lifesteal. Their value varies a lot depending on the character and the weapon that you're using. In general, lifesteal is very good with fast weapons or the ones that can release multiple projectiles. Health regeneration instead is very valuable for more tanky characters, especially if they can't rely on weapons for the lifesteal. A secondary way of healing is through consumable, which can be a good alternative or complement to health regeneration. I'm considering utility stats everything that is not explicitly offense or defense. They're all very different stats, and their value depends a lot on the character and the weapon that is being used. The most important ones are speed, range, and luck. Speed can be considered a defensive stat, and it's very good to avoid damage, especially from elite and bosses. I would recommend at least 10 to 20% on almost every character, but more is always better as long as you're comfortable with it. Range could be considered both an offensive and a defensive stat. More range is almost always good, but it's often not a priority. It's a lot more useful for most melee weapons since it provides extra safety and reach with each swing. A comfortable amount of range is usually around 100. Luck could be considered an economy and defensive stat. It can generate value over time by getting more crates, higher items, and level ups, but that aspect of the stat is often the least important one. The main value of luck is increasing the chance of getting consumables, which can be extremely good to sustain characters that struggle with healing themselves. That's mostly it for the main stats, but remember, even if this is the general priority, it doesn't have to be followed as strictly. Higher tiers and level ups or good items in the shop can shift our priorities simply because they're more efficient, but in general, balancing stats is a very important aspect of the game. For example, even if economy stats are often more valuable early on, that doesn't mean they're always the absolute priority. Keeping up with our damage and defenses is still important. Also, there are some exceptions for certain characters, but I'll cover the specifics on my following guide. Another important aspect of the game is how to handle rerolls. Even if we know the stats that we want, they're all not always offered to us. Rerolling in order to find them is always an option, but that costs materials, and sometimes it's often better to accept something else. Deciding when to reroll or to accept the current stat or item can be fairly subjective, and it depends on the situation, but these few tips can help you in making the decision. Let's talk about the level rerolls first. In most situations, don't reroll too much only for one specific stat, but it's okay if you're looking for a few of them. You can reroll some more when you have guaranteed higher tier stats, so every 5 levels. Rerolling a few times on the first levels for some early harvesting is also very good on most characters, or to get a random good tier 2 stat. Usually I set good tier 1 stats before level 5, but try to get tier 2 stats after, unless some tier 1 stats are still very good and you really need that money for the shop. Shop rerolls are a bit more complicated. The first 2 shops have 2 slots reserved for weapons and 2 for items. Since your priority is finding weapons, you can lock up to 2 good items and still roll for weapons without any real downside. Then you can buy those items in later waves after prioritizing your weapons. Almost every item is technically a positive, but since you're buying them with materials, many of them are usually not worth the money for your current build. Some items are very good for almost every character, but many others are more or less valuable depending on the character and the weapon that is being used. In general, try to boost your stats based on the general priority, while avoiding items that are minor upgrades or too situational. Also, try to avoid items with bad trades, like the ones that give you 2 mostly useless or even negative stats in exchange for a good one. However, since this is a big topic, I'll talk more about the value of items for certain builds and characters in my following guides. Waves in Brotato become progressively harder, but not entirely. There are other factors to take into account, like Horde and Elite waves, but also your character becoming stronger over time. This progression is slightly different between the old map, the Crash Zone, and the new one, the Abyss. For this reason, I'll try to analyze them separately. Crash Zone early game, wave 1 to 6, is usually fairly easy. Wave 7 can be problematic if you can keep up with the eggs. Wave 8 can be dangerous against the chargers, and Wave 9 can be dangerous if your build struggles against many enemies. However, Wave 10 has a significant power spike that often kills many builds. Having good damage and some sustain is often very important to survive Wave 10, especially since it becomes considerably harder towards the end. Wave 11 and 12 are usually dangerous when they have an Elite or Horde wave. Wave 13 instead has many tanky enemies, but it's often not as problematic. Wave 14 can be extremely deadly for melee builds, especially when it has an Elite. This is because there are many ranged enemies that are hard to reach. Wave 15 is similar to 14, but overall has less ranged enemies. Late game waves, from 16 onward, are usually fairly easy as long as you have a good balance of offensive and defensive stats, especially with extra harvesting to support your economy. The Elite in Wave 17-18 can still be dangerous, but it's usually a lot easier in comparison to the previous ones. This is because the player tends to scale more than the enemies. Wave 20 bosses can be extremely challenging at first. It's all about learning their patterns, and then deciding if it's better to attempt killing them or simply surviving depending on your build. I'll talk a bit more about this later in the video. The Abyss is a bit harder to streamline since I don't have as much experience with it. Important factors are that the Wave 4 and 8 tend to be harder in comparison to the Crash Zone, mostly because there are more enemies with range attacks or charge abilities. However, Wave 10 doesn't seem to be as demanding as the Crash Zone version. Horde and Elite seems fairly similar overall. Elite in particular felt even easier, but their patterns were adjusted multiple times, so I'm not entirely sure since it also varies a lot depending on the character and the build. Wave 16 and 18 in particular can be a lot more challenging in comparison to their counterpart in the Crash Zone. This is because they spawn many bold aliens in their incubator, which transforms them into these monstrosities that are hard to kill and deal a lot of damage. Especially when combined with an Elite, Wave 18 can be extremely dangerous. Wave 20 bosses are also harder to kill in comparison to the Crash Zone's ones, since they move a lot more and their attacks end up generating more projectiles. Initially, the Abyss felt a lot harder, but due to many nerfs and after getting used to the new enemies, I think that the Crash Zone and the Abyss are very similar in difficulty. One major difference is that the Abyss seems less demanding in the mid-game, but more dangerous in the late game, making for a more linear scaling and difficulty. Also, another reason why the Abyss might seem harder than the Crash Zone is the curse itself, but I'll talk more about the curse later in the video. Check your Elite and Horde encounters at the start of every run. Depending on what you're facing, it can shift your stat priorities. The first Elite or Horde wave will be on wave 11 or 12. The second one is on 14 or 15. The third one is always an Elite, and it will be on 17 or 18. In case of Horde waves, prioritize damage even more. You're not escaping from the Horde, so you need to have enough damage in order to keep up. Lifesteal or luck for some extra consumables can be quite useful, but still not a priority over damage. Ranged weapons can be more vulnerable to Horde waves. You need more damage to compensate or mix them up with explosive weapons. Pierce is also very helpful. In case of elites, movement speed is extremely valuable. I recommend at least 10%, but more is always better as long as you're not sacrificing other good stats. There is no best way to approach elites, and most of the encounters are about learning their attack pattern. High damage builds can kill elites in a matter of seconds. This is usually easier to achieve with ranged weapons, since you can afford to build more offensive stats, taking advantage of the extra safety that you get from being ranged. Melee builds can still do it, but it's a bit more dangerous. Builds with high defenses can slowly kill elites while being relatively safe thanks to their ability to mitigate and sustain the damage taken. Even if you don't have enough damage to kill the elite, simply surviving by prioritizing other enemies is often good enough. Some runs, especially with some characters, are often too weak by the time you encounter your first elite. In that case, don't even try to kill it and focus on surviving, prioritizing other enemies to avoid being overwhelmed as you move around. Even if your damage seems fine at first, take into account that many elites and the waves itself become more dangerous towards the end. Most losses are often caused by forcing a kill on an elite when we are too weak to do it safely. Bosses should be approached in a similar way to elite, so it ultimately depends on your build. Curse is a new mechanic introduced with the DLC Abyssal Terrors. Curse increases the chance of finding cursed enemies, the ones with a purple outline, and cursed items, which are stronger versions of regular items, usually with more upsides and less downsides. Cursed enemies are also stronger versions of regular ones. They drop more materials and they have more stats, but especially their health can drastically scale with the amount of curse that you have, making them extremely hard to kill. Outside of a few specific characters, curse starts at 0 and it can be obtained by killing curse hoarders, or by buying these items. After that, you can gain more curse from cursed items. The curse mechanic is still fairly new, and considering all the characters and all their possible builds, it takes a while to test everything properly. However, my first impression after dozens of runs with various characters, both old and new, is that the curse is primarily a downside and that it should be avoided. The main problem with the curse is that it makes the game harder by facing stronger enemies, while the upside, the cursed items that you might find, are just random. So you're getting a guaranteed disadvantage without knowing if you'll get any real value out of it, which can be quite bad if you care about consistency. So, if you find very good items for your build, the curse can be a positive, but that's not guaranteed, and by buying these cursed items, you're also making the game even harder since they will keep increasing your curse level. This is also more problematic on certain vulnerable characters that rely on their unique mechanic in order to scale properly. Stacking curse is comparable to getting extra enemies, but the main difference is that those enemies are only scaling in number, when with enough damage, they become almost irrelevant. Cursed enemies being a lot harder to kill makes this a lot more problematic. This doesn't mean that you should avoid good cursed items. I don't recommend actively killing the curse hoarders just to stack the curse in the attempt of getting cursed items, but sometimes, especially with ranged builds, it becomes unavoidable to kill some of them. In that case, if you end up finding a very good cursed item, there is no reason not to go for it. Just don't buy mediocre ones only because they're higher value than normal. The curse will quickly become a big downside if your cursed items are not strong enough to compensate for it. Then again, all this is just an early opinion based on general consistency. I think the curse mechanic is overall pretty interesting and adds more variance to the game, which is nice for replayability even if not as much for consistency. Also, a few tips for people that are interested in playing with random weapons. Any good weapon works on most character, even if it's not the best. If the weapon is bad but has the same tag as good weapons, roll with it and try to slowly transition into better weapons. Sell the weapon and just buy better ones if you roll into them first. If the weapon is bad and doesn't share the tag with better weapons, just sell it and roll for better weapons instead. That's it for this general guide. The next one will focus on the primary types of builds that you can go for on Brotato, and the best starting weapons for each one. It's also possible that I forgot something important, but if you have questions, feel free to ask in the comments or follow me on Twitch, since there will be a lot more Brotato once the DLC releases. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.